Welcome to Neural Nexus Podcast, where we explore the hottest topics shaping the world. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping straight into the sources you sent over today.
Yeah, and they give us a really interesting perspective, don't they?
They really do. We're looking at how these, geopolitical pressures are playing out, affecting global brands, regional stability, kind of everything.
That's right. The material lets us look at two main things here. First, there's this comparison how global brands have reacted differently in, say, Russia versus Israel.
Right. And then second,
we've got that BBC News report you sent, which details the recent Israeli strikes on Iran. So quite a lot to unpack.
Definitely. So our goal here is just to, unpack it all, pull out the key points, and try to understand the nuances in what these sources are presenting. Sound good?
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
Okay. So that first source, it kicks off by looking back at Russia, doesn't it? After the 2022 conflict started, kind of setting a baseline.
Exactly. It talks about this precedent for brand exits when things get geopolitically intense.
And the scale in Russia was just, huge. The source says over 1,000 international brands pulled out. We're talking big names, McDonald's, H&M, IKEA, just to name a few it mentions.
And the why behind it, according to the analysis you shared, was sort of a perfect storm, wasn't it?
It seems like it.
You had the direct political pressure, international sanctions, but then also this huge wave of reputational pressure.
Yeah, coming from consumers, shareholders, governments, pretty much everywhere.
And the economic hit for Russia. The source uses the word colossal. About, 24% of companies relocated operations?
Something like that. Investment dried up, foreign capital fled. It really paints a picture of what happens when those pressures reach a certain point.
Which, sets us up nicely to look at the current situation in Israel as the same source describes it.
Right, because it notes parallels starting to show up, even if the scale is different.
Driven by the military actions in Gaza, the international criticism that's been growing, and protests, especially in places like the U.S., UK, Europe, key part.
And you see it hitting consumer behavior. Boycotts targeting Israeli goods, sure, but also global brands seen as supporting Israel.
Yeah, the source specifically calls out McDonald's, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, even Shane, says they're facing heat and seeing sales drop, particularly in Arab and Muslim countries.
And here's something I found really specific in the material. It's not just vibes, right? Some retail chains are actually removing Israeli goods from shelves.
That's a tangible step.
And on the flip side, local alternatives are booming. The source mentioned local colas, Chat Cola, and Salam Cola. Sales up over 40%. That's significant.
Huge jump. So you have these clear pressures, the consumer action, the public sentiment, but, and this is the core point the source makes.
Why isn't it like Russia? Why the difference?
Why aren't we seeing that same kind of mass exodus of brands from Israel? At least, not yet.
So what's the reason given?
The source talks about a complex system of balance in Israel's case.
Okay.
Yeah.
Unpack that balance for us. What's holding it together, so to speak?
Well, the analysis points to a few key things. First, Israel is still seen as a major tech and investment hub. Companies have roots there in science, defense, IT. Leaving isn't just about losing market access, it's potentially a bigger strategic cost.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Second, and this seems crucial, there just isn't that international consensus or, importantly, state-level sanctions targeting businesses operating in Israel like we saw with Russia.
Ah, right. The official pressure isn't there in the same way.
Precisely. And third, the boycotts, while definitely having an impact, are described as mainly civilian efforts. They don't carry the same legal weight or regulatory consequences as the official sanctions regime Russia faced. It's more reputational damage versus, direct legal and financial blocks.
So when you put them side by side, the contrast is pretty stark based on the source's comparison points.
Absolutely. Let's just run through them quickly.
Yeah.
Brand exit. Mass and public in Russia, sort of spotty, more restrained in Israel so far.
Okay.
Sanctions. Tough international ones against Russia. Basically none aimed at businesses in Israel.
Got it.
Investment climate. Got much worse, fast, in Russia. Decreasing in Israel, but the source doesn't call it critical.
Right.
Boycotts. Happened against Russia, but maybe less widespread initially, versus widespread boycotts now related to Israel, but without those legal teeth.
And the overall pressure.
Financial, legal, and reputational in Russia. Primarily reputational, it seems, in Israel's case for now.
So the source kind of leaves it hanging a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It calls Russia historic, says Israel's avoiding that for now, but sees alarming signals.
Yeah, the big question it raises is whether those signals become systemic. Will that balance shift?
Okay, let's pivot then. The second source you provided, the BBC report, takes us somewhere else entirely.
Right. From economic pressures to direct military action, this details the Israeli strikes on Iran.
And according to this report, they kicked off Friday, June 13th, the stated aim, facilities tied to Iran's nuclear program.
Yeah, the report gets quite specific about locations allegedly hit. Uranium enrichment plants, Natanz and Fordo are mentioned. Also missile bases in Kermanshah and Khorramabad.
And strikes in cities, too.
Reportedly, yes. Tehran, Isfahan, Tabriz were named.
Wow. And casualties. The report touches on that, too.
It does. It mentions reports of several high-ranking Iranian commanders killed and also at least 6 nuclear scientists. It specifically names Hossein Salami, the head of the IRGC, among those reported killed, though it does caution that casualty lists might vary.
And there's some background context given for why this happened now.
Yeah, the report cites Prime Minister Netanyahu saying he ordered planning way back in November 2024.
November 24, okay.
He apparently linked it to seeing clear signs Iran was going for nuclear weapons, taking felt steps, as he put it. Interestingly, the source says the operation was actually meant for late April 2025 but got delayed. Doesn't say why, just various reasons.
Okay, so shifting to the actual operation, the IDF confirmed it was happening, right? Operation Rising Lion.
That's the name reported, yes. And there was that detail from a high-level Israeli official cited by the Wall Street Journal claiming it was planned to last 14 days.
14 days. That suggests it wasn't just a single strike.
Exactly. And that lines up with military experts quoted in the source. They saw it as something planned long and seriously, possibly multi-stage, not a one-off hit.
The sources you shared also touched on why the strikes were supposedly effective.
They did. Points raised by Israeli sources or experts mention things like Iranian air defense not being very effective, even though Israel had kind of signaled its readiness. There was also some speculation reported about maybe not all attacks being air-based.
And then there were those more cloak and dagger details about Mossad operations.
Right. The report included alleged details from an Israeli security source. Things like placing precision weapons near air defense sites, using tech against radars, even setting up a drone base near Tehran.
So surprise and intelligence played a big role, according to those accounts.
Seems so. One expert cited attributed the success of the first phase to the effect of surprise and deep intelligence penetration. That same expert mentioned claims apparently going around the IDF about over 200 aircraft hitting over 100 targets initially, with more strikes expected over potentially several weeks.
And the immediate fallout, what did the report say happened right away?
Pretty significant disruption. Airspace closures popped up almost immediately over Israel, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Syria.
Which must have caused chaos for air travel.
Absolutely. Major international airlines canceling or rerouting flights. The report named Emirates, Qatar Airways, Air France, Lufthansa, Air India.
Air India had quite a few affected.
Yeah, the source said they rerouted or canceled 16 flights on routes between India and London, Canada, the U.S., and disruptions at big hubs like Abu Dhabi and Dubai were also reported.
What about Iran's response?
Well, the report cites the IDF claiming Iran launched about 100 drones shortly after. Israel, in turn, claimed it intercepted all of them. A BBC correspondent quoted offered a perspective that these might have been largely symbolic, questioning Iran's immediate capacity for a major direct military hitback.
But Iran denied sending them.
But Iran, yes, the report notes, denied sending those drones, but did promise swift retaliation was coming. So conflicting accounts there.
And internally in Iran.
Protests were reported. Tehran, other cities. People demanding a quick, strong response to the Israeli strikes.
And Israel closed its embassies for the day.
Diplomatic missions globally, yeah. Just for the day as a precaution, according to the source.
Okay, let's talk international reactions. What did the report capture there?
Pretty much widespread calls for restraint. World leaders urging both sides to, calm down, avoid escalating things further. The UK, France, Germany, Turkey, China, Oman, Saudi Arabia all mentioned as calling for de-escalation.
Any specific stances highlighted?
Yeah, France and Germany reportedly affirmed Israel's right to self-defense but stressed the need for restraint. Turkey and Saudi Arabia apparently condemned the strikes. Oman blamed Israel. China expressed deep concern.
And the UN?
The Security Council was set to meet, the report said, at Iran's request. Iran had publicly called the attack a declaration of war and wanted the UNSC to step in.
What about the U.S. position? The report detailed that too, right?
It did. The U.S. said it didn't participate in the strikes, but President Trump reportedly knew about the plans. He called the operation very successful publicly.
And linked it to stopping Iran getting nuclear weapons.
Yep, and even suggested that outcome would be great for the market. He urged Iran to make a nuclear deal quickly. The report also adds that Iran then canceled some planned talks with a U.S. delegation.
Finally, the economic ripple effect. Oil prices.
That was immediate. Brent crude jumped about 7%, hitting around $73 a barrel right after the news broke. That's got obvious global implications. U.S. market indexes dipped slightly initially too, but the oil price jump was the main economic data point highlighted.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive based on your sources, we've really covered two quite different angles on these current geopolitical tensions.
We really have, from the, complicated pressures on global companies trying to navigate these situations, dealing with politics and public opinion,
Right, yeah.
all the way to the specifics of a planned direct military operation between states. Your sources really highlight how interconnected and, frankly, volatile things are right now.
They certainly do. It really makes you think about how these different kinds of pressure, the economic, the reputational, the military, might interact or influence each other down the line.
Absolutely. And just thinking aloud here, building on that, remember how the first source talked about the pressure on brands in Israel not being systemic yet?
Yeah.
That it was this sort of balance for now?
Yeah, that complex system of balance.
So here's something for you to maybe mull over. Considering what the second source described, a major multi-stage military operation planned long and seriously, how might that developing situation potentially shift the ground for those global brands? Could it tip that balance the first source described? Or will those distinctions between the Russia situation and the Israel situation continue to hold, even with rising military conflict?
That's definitely something to think about, a really provocative question to end on. Thanks for sharing these sources and letting us dig into them with you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.